Many lonely and remote parts of the UK echo with tales of local spirits, such as the Grey Man of Bellister. These legends often refer to misdeeds of centuries past, specific locations that give rise to sad tales, or stories that provide an explanation for natural features. Some even act as a warning, and the Grey Man would appear to fall into this category. Once fond of a ruined castle and a broken road, the Grey Man of Bellister wanders in the twilight. Yet he's not a regular presence. Some believe he hasn't been seen for at least a century or more. But that's probably for the best. Old tales tell of disaster following a sighting. But anyway, get comfortable and leave the mundane world aside for a few moments. Come and meet the Grey Man of Bellister in this week's episode of Fabulous Folklore. Hello there and welcome to Fabulous Folklore, the podcast for all things folklore, occult and just a bit weird. I'm your host, Icy Sedgwick, blogger, fantasy author and your guide into these rather mysterious realms. I've got some rare things to show you, so come on in, take a look around, but be careful not to touch anything. These things sometimes bite. Well, hello there and welcome back to Fabulous Folklore with me, your host, Icy Sedgwick. We are into October, which means ghosts and spooky things and supernatural shenanigans on the podcast. Can you tell that I'm excited? This is by far my favourite time of the year. And quite frankly, it's made even better this year because I'm actually going to hear ghost stories at Tynemouth Priory on Halloween itself. So I'm super excited for basically this entire month. Hurrah! And yes, that's basically how I get my kicks when I'm not recording. But anyway, we are starting off with the Grey Man of Bellister this month. And this is a local story to me. It is in Northumberland, so it's kind of local, all things considered. And I remember I first read about this years and years ago in that pamphlet that I've mentioned a few times, Ghosts and Legends of Northumbria. It was in that one, or more Ghosts and Legends of Northumbria. It was one of the two. And the story just always kind of stuck with me, which is why we're looking at it now. So without any further ado, let's go and meet the Grey Man of Bellister. So Bellister Castle lies 1.3 kilometres southwest of Haltwhistle in Northumberland on the south bank of the River South Tyne, and it's now both a scheduled ancient monument and a Grade 1 listed building. Now, the Blenkinsopp family originally built Bellister Castle, and it's believed the name Bellister comes from Old French meaning something like fine sight, and given the number of picturesque walks in the area, I'm inclined to agree with them. Now, Bellister Castle itself is a bit of a mishmash of building styles, with a 19th century manor attached to the ruins of a 14th century tower. Records show that a hall with a moat actually stood on the site in the 13th century, but by 1541 a tower house stood on the site. Now, the Blenkinsopp family actually owned the property until 1697 when they sold their estate, and it's since had a whole series of owners. It was rebuilt by John Dobson, the legendary Tyneside architect himself, and it also sadly suffered fire damage in 1901. Now, the National Trust currently own it, but because they let it out to long-term tenants, you can't actually visit, but you can, as I say, go for various walks in the area. So what exactly is the legend of the Grey Man of Bellister? Well, here goes. One night, centuries ago, a wandering minstrel knocked on the door of Bellister Castle. He was seeking food and shelter in exchange for music, which was a common arrangement in those times. The Baron agreed and invited him in, keen for entertainment. It's also possible that such minstrels helped to carry news around the country while they were on their travels, so perhaps the Baron invited him in so he could get some kind of interesting discussions going on. Yet, as the wine and music flowed, the Baron started to grow suspicious. While the minstrel played his border ballads, the Baron swore that the minstrel's features had changed. He'd somehow grown younger. Could the minstrel actually be a spy in disguise for one of his neighbours, or his enemies? After all, he was in the depths of a feud with a neighbouring baron. This minstrel could indeed be a spy in his household. Despite the fact he had absolutely no proof that any of this was real, the Baron glared at the minstrel all night, his previous hospitality and good cheer completely gone. Eventually, the old minstrel begged to retire for the night. No doubt he'd grown more than a little frightened of the Baron's inexplicable animosity. But the Baron couldn't shake his suspicions even after the minstrel went to bed, and finally he ordered that the minstrel be brought before him so he could question him. A search of the castle revealed that the minstrel had actually left. While we would recognise that the minstrel probably did so to preserve his safety, the Baron took this as confirmation that he was indeed right and the minstrel was actually a spy, and that he had left in order to go and tell whoever he was working for what he'd learned, or because he was worried that he'd been discovered. So obviously, because he's now convinced of the minstrel's guilt, the Baron set loose his bloodhounds, and the dogs found the minstrel cowering on the banks of the Tyne by the willow trees, terrified and alone. Now, according to one version of the tale, the dogs actually tore the minstrel to pieces before the Baron arrived. In another version, the Baron arrived and actually rescued the minstrel from the dogs, only to have him hanged from a nearby tree. This may explain why the sycamore tree in front of the castle is called the hanging tree, but whichever version happened, the minstrel never returned to the castle alive. Now, the minstrel's guilt, or indeed innocence, was never proven, and obviously the law never actually punished the Baron for his treatment of a guest, or, dare I say, mistreatment of a guest. Yet the other world offers a different set of rules, and the minstrel returned as the Grey Man. He became the Baron's constant companion. He often followed the Baron along the road to Bellister whenever the Baron returned after sunset. If you believe the legend, the Grey Man actually hounded the Baron into an early grave, so where the Baron was never punished by legal means, he was still punished by supernatural means. But incidentally, it didn't just end there, because the Grey Man also became a harbinger of doom for the Blenkinsopp family. Indeed, as far as the stories go, disaster followed every sighting. But the extinction of the Blenkinsopp family did little to quench the Grey Man's desire for revenge. If we then move forward some centuries, M.A. Richardson's Table Book of 1846 tells a tale of an encounter with the Grey Man of Bellister that was recited some 50 years previously, so we're looking at the very, very end of the 18th century. In the story, a young man needed work, and he made his way towards Bellister Castle. He crossed the Tyne at Haltwhistle, where the path became broken and difficult. Now, instead of turning round and going back to Haltwhistle, the young man decided to follow the path, but of course by that point night had begun to descend, and the young man didn't want to be on the road alone. He'd heard the stories of bandits on the forgotten country roads, and he wished for some company. Lo and behold, he saw a figure up ahead. Now, he hadn't seen anyone since he crossed the river, but he put his unease aside at the prospect of company. The lad shouted out a greeting, but the traveller didn't respond. He neither slowed down nor stopped. Long white hair tumbled down his back and a grey cloak flapped around his ankles. The lad later reported that he even carried a bundle of some description. The job seeker finally reached the decrepit gateway of the old castle, and upon crossing the threshold, the stranger finally turned to look at him. And this comes from Richardson's Table Book, and I quote, "Death had set his pallid seal on that grisly countenance, and a bloody gash that ran across it heightened the expression of ghastliness imprinted there. The thick beard was dripping with blood, and the forepart of its garments were dyed with the ensanguined stream. It fixed its large, lustreless eyes upon the youth, and pointing with a hideous scowl towards the dilapidated ruin, melted silently away." End quote. Now, obviously naturally shaken by this experience, the young man paused for a time, unsure of what to do, but then he decided, you know what, I'm here now, and he actually continued on into the castle. And only the old mistress was at home, and the young man decided that she seemed like a nice person, so he told her what he'd seen outside. Now, she was actually horrified, having heard the stories of the spirit from her elders, and she even personally knew some of the people who had seen it. But there was a problem. No one ever actually saw the spirit without some accompanying calamity, especially when the spirit seemed as vindictive as it had that evening. And unfortunately, the old woman's fears proved well founded. The young lad actually fell ill that evening, and he died before morning. So what do we actually make of this postscript of the story? Well, Richardson explained, and I quote, "The Grey Man no longer appears at Bellister or traverses the broken pathway, near which the clump of willow still responds in sad murmurs to the wizard blast of evening. But Bellister and its vicinity continues to be a haunted and forbidden place after nightfall." End quote. So, as I say, he was saying that this story had happened 50 years previously in a book that came out in 1846, and stories of recent Grey Man sightings apparently still circulated in about 1800. And according to William James Palmer, sightings were, and I quote, "ever the prelude of some impending misfortunes to the house of Bellister and its dependents," end quote. Clearly, whoever was living in Bellister in the 1800s was not related to the Blenkensopps who sold the house in 1697, but the Grey Man of Bellister seemed to decide he was just going to take out his fury on anyone who lived there, regardless of how they were related to the original family. Now, the problem that we have with the story, and this is where the discussion really comes in, is neither Palmer nor Richardson actually list the results of any of these unfortunate omens. They say, yes, calamity has always followed every time someone has seen the Grey Man, but there isn't a specific thing of, oh, someone saw the Grey Man and then this happened. So the legend talks about omens but doesn't give any specifics, which makes it a little bit more difficult to know if this is indeed a true story or if it's just a legend that's grown up around the area. And also, the other problem that we have with the story is that we don't actually know when the murder of the minstrel took place. So Richardson describes it as being many centuries ago, but he doesn't actually say when that was, and referring to the Baron doesn't specify which head of the Blenkinsopp family it actually was, which also makes it a little bit more difficult to ascertain when the story might have taken place. And the only timing that we really have is the fact that Richardson said the young man encountered the Grey Man around about 50 years previously, which, as I say, would put it in the very, very late 1790s. So you do wonder, did this story get added onto the original legend? And it is possible, because stories claim that deaths follow sightings. So obviously in this case we do have a death following a sighting, but there aren't any specifics for the earlier one. So as I say, it's difficult to know which came first. In some ways, we don't know if the story was put about by one of the neighbouring enemies. So did one of the Baron's neighbours decide to put this legend about, essentially besmirch his name even further? Did it actually happen? And obviously, it's also a bit of a cautionary tale that you should pay your freelancers and treat them well so that these things don't happen. But there again, another legend actually claims that the sycamore got the nickname of hanging tree because cavaliers apparently hung roundheads here during the English Civil War. Now, that one I can actually believe, so it does then make you wonder if somebody took the nickname of the hanging tree and either extrapolated backwards to create a story that would also explain why it was called that, or they simply conflated that with the story of the Grey Man. Either way, whether the Grey Man exists or not, people do still consider it unwise to venture along that road or the riverbank after dark. It is interesting, however, that so many of the paths in the area are considered a beautiful countryside walk during the day, so it does rather seem to be a bit of a strange story, because even Richardson was saying that there weren't any sightings of the Grey Man in 1846, and I haven't been able to find any legends of sightings after that point anyway. So it's become a story that's almost become like a meta story, that it's a story about a story rather than being a legend that we can specifically point to even now. But there again, how do we know that there isn't some kind of legend? Because if the paths are forgotten and abandoned after dark, you then have the problem of there's no one to actually encounter the Grey Man of Bellister, so he could be merrily wandering around and just nobody's seeing him. So that is indeed the other issue. And obviously, I don't know if it makes a difference to the Grey Man that the National Trust now owns the castle, and whoever lives there isn't even the owner, they're just an occupier. Who knows? If you've heard this legend before, do feel free to let me know in all the usual methods, as Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, all that kind of jazz. Or if you know any similar ones, because I dare say there's probably stories very, very similar in other parts of the country, so it would be really interesting to hear regional variations, because if there are regional variations, that would rather imply that the whole thing has essentially just been passed on with word of mouth and regional variations made up, perhaps by a minstrel turning up to tell a ghost story to entertain his host for the evening. So either way, I hope you enjoyed the story of the Grey Man. If you do go for any of the walks around Bellister, do keep an eye out for him. If you do see him, do let me know, because that would be cool. But obviously, watch how you go. We are going to have a look at the concept of grey ladies in theatres and assembly rooms, so that should be quite interesting. Also, I wanted to make a tiny little announcement that I am going to be adding a new type of content to the podcast. So at the moment, we have these weekly episodes that come out on a Saturday, which are about a topic, and it's just me telling you what I've learned in order to research these podcast episodes. I do occasionally do book reviews when I've actually got enough to say, so there will be some more of those coming as well, because I'm slowly making my way through my to read pile. But I'm also going to be adding interviews as well. So I've recorded my first interview with Amaya Rourke, the astrologer and folk witch, so that's going to be coming out probably next week now. And I'm not going to replace these episodes with interviews. The interviews are going to be on top of, but there's probably only going to be maybe one a month, one every other month, depending on how the editing schedule and so on goes. So it's just basically an opportunity to bring new people to you and also bring new ideas to you as well. So hopefully you'll enjoy those. But these usual Saturday episodes will still stay in their current format. So don't worry about that. This is just something extra that I'm adding in. So I hope that you enjoy that whenever it happens to land. But that is the end of this week's episode. I hope that you have a marvellous week ahead, and I will see you next week when we go to meet the Grey Ladies of a couple of theatres and assembly rooms. Cheerio. Well, thank you for listening, and thanks for visiting Fabulous Folklore. I hope you enjoyed your stay. If you did, why not consider subscribing in your podcast app of choice? If you enjoy the show, why not leave me a review and help other listeners to find it as well? And if you'd like bonus exclusive episodes of the podcast, then why not support me on Patreon? It does help me to keep the show going, and it means that you get a little bit extra every month as well. And you can find all of the necessary links in the show notes below. So without any further ado, I will bid you adieu, and I hope that you have safe travels wherever you're going on to next.